I said to all of you that we shouldn't leave unless we had a supplemental that dealt with Zika, that dealt with Flint, that dealt with opioids, and some other subjects. We did leave, we came back, and we still do not have any action on Zika and Flint. Opioids, the Speaker says, going through the regular order, so let's hope that that happens. The bill that passed the Senate still doesn't have any funding. We still need funding for that. But that's what this morning is about. It's about the budget. Let's call upon this Republican majority. They're so consumed by their radical ideology, so disconnected from reality that even the pleas of expectant mothers and poisoned children fall on deaf ears. We are here to make sure the American family's message to the Republican Congress is heard. Do your job. Instead of doing their job to protect the lives of children and families, Republicans are wasting this week grandstanding on the IRS. In the Republican Congress, if you're not a special interest or a big corporation, you're on your own. Whether it's Flint, Zika, the road to ruin, budget, our colleagues here on the front lines of that fight. I'm pleased now to yield to the distinguished chair of the Democratic Caucus, a person who has served on the Budget Committee, is a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Xavier Becerra.
Madam Leader, thank you. I'm pleased to join my colleagues who've been in this fight for quite some time. 2 days ago, all of us who work in this country knew we had a deadline. We had to pay our taxes. And while sometimes you look at the amount you're paying, you say, gosh, I hope it's going to be used well, we still have a responsibility. We know by the deadline, usually April 15th, this year, April 18th, we had a responsibility. Pay your taxes. You don't pay your taxes, there are consequences. You can pay a penalty. You might pay interest as well on not having paid on time. There are consequences for not doing your job. We're essentially telling our colleagues here in Congress, do your job. Now, the budget for the federal government is one of the principal responsibilities we have. Just like any family has to figure out its budget to make sure it can make ends meet, we have a responsibility to pass a budget. We were supposed to do that by April 15th. That's not been done. Now, that's a historic failure. And to not pass a budget is not just a historic failure, it's a historic failure to fulfill one of the most basic responsibilities of governing. I believe that, but those aren't my words. Those are the words of former Budget Chairman Paul Ryan, now Speaker of the House Paul Ryan. Historic failure. Responsibilities of governing. We have a very simple job to do in this place that every American takes for granted because they know they have to do it. And if they don't do it, there are consequences. There are grave consequences when Congress doesn't do its job. And you're going to hear people talk about all those different consequences. But right now on the floor of the House, we're debating bills that are going to go nowhere having to do with the IRS while we watch, and Republicans seem to be asleep at the wheel as we watch companies go through this game of inversion so they don't have to pay taxes in this country while Americans just this past week had to file their taxes. It's time for Congress to do its job because guess what? There are real consequences for a lot of people. We just simply say to our colleagues, let's wake up in the morning, understand we've got to do our job. And if we don't, there will be consequences. With that, let me now yield to my colleague from Connecticut, Rosa DeLauro.
Thank you, Congressman Becerra. Madam Leader, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with Congressman Kildee and Congressman Swalwell. As has been said, and the leader pointed this out, that we have three public health crises in this country: the opioid epidemic, the lead poisoning in Flint, and the Zika virus. Let me spend a moment talking to you about Zika. Congress has to take immediate action to stop the spread of Zika in the United States. We can invest in stopping it, or we can let people in this country get infected and suffer. In the last week, Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, said, and I quote, "We have to act now. If the regular appropriations process takes too long, I don't want to have to wait to develop a vaccine, end quote. According to the CDC Director, Dr. Thomas Frieden, quote, there is no longer any doubt that Zika causes microcephaly. Never before in history has there been a situation where a mosquito bite can result in devastating malformation, end quote. There is no ambiguity. Zika causes debilitating brain damage. And while we dawdle, children may die. Today, and just a few days ago, health officials split over advice on pregnancy in Zika areas. What does this say? Physicians are determining whether they are going to say to American women, particularly those who live in the Gulf states, where this mosquito is prevalent, they are thinking about talking to them about avoiding conception, that being the only sure way to avoid the birth of deformed babies. Is this the message that we want to send to American women? Don't get pregnant? Due to the majority's refusal to consider the emergency request, the administration has been forced to redirect $510 million from Ebola to deal with an immediate Zika response. Let me be clear. These funds are being directed away from other critical and threatening global health risks and are being repurposed, shifted only as a last resort, not because it's the right thing to do from a policy perspective. In fact, the White House has said that these funds will need to be restored because Ebola is not over. We cannot abandon our fight in West Africa, where Ebola continues to flare up. This is unacceptable. It is unconscionable that in the midst of a global health crisis, that we cannot and will not appropriate emergency funds to save lives. Congress needs to do its job, what we were sent here for, what our moral responsibility is to do its job on Zika. I urge my colleagues, we all urge our colleagues, both sides of the aisle, not to put American women and families in the predicament of choosing whether or not they should get pregnant, or if they are already pregnant, wondering whether or not their baby is okay. That's where we are today. We need to move. We need to act immediately. Thank you, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you someone who's been a leader on the fight to really do something about the poisoning of 9,000 children with lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosa. And, you know, it's tough to stand here again and talk about this crisis in my hometown, especially when what I hear from my Republican colleagues and even Republican leaders is great sympathy for the 100,000 people of my hometown. It's almost as if they feel their obligation is to send their good wishes, basically to send Flint a get well card. This is a crisis. This is a crisis that is ongoing. In Flint, Michigan, today, this morning, every single family wakes up to a city with water that's not drinkable. Today, it's been 2 years since this lead has been running through the water of the city of Flint. It has been 9 months since this became known as a crisis. Yet while our state government continues to make excuses and treat it as a public relations problem, these American citizens can't drink water and are facing consequences, long-term consequences to a crisis that was as a result of the callous failure of state officials. It's a disaster. One of the first votes that I cast when I came to Congress, Congressman Swalwell and I came in together early in 2013. We cast a vote to provide relief for the victims of Hurricane Sandy. Not people in my district, but I will say this. I was proud as an American as an American representative in Congress, to do what I could to help these Americans who were suffering. And all I ask is the same thing for the people in my hometown. People in Congress are elected not just to hold a position, but to actually do a job. Whether it's pass a budget, deal with the major crises. These American citizens in Flint, Michigan have a right to have their federal government come to their aid when they are in crisis, when their health is threatened, when the livelihood of the people in this city is threatened, where the future of the children of Flint is threatened. And yet, the Republican Congress turns a blind eye and fails to act. I can tell you, speaking for myself, but I know from my colleagues who have been enormously helpful in reaching out to the people of Flint, and many of you have come to Flint. I know they're not going to leave Flint behind. We need to make sure we have a Congress that is as good as its people. We're better than this. We are better than this as a nation. We cannot let the people of Flint behind and write off 9,000 children. And with that, let me introduce, again, my classmate and colleague, a man who has been doing an enormous amount of work for our caucus and for the people of this country, Eric Swalwell. Eric.
Thank you, Representative Kildee, and to my colleagues and Leader Pelosi for holding this conference. What we have heard here is that people across our country are asking House Republicans on the issues that matter most to them to simply do your job. When it comes to addressing corporate inversions, people are saying, if you want to help me protect my job, you need to do your job. When it comes to stopping the spread of the Zika virus, people across the country are telling House Republicans it's time to honor the administration's requests and do your job. When it comes to collaborating with Democrats and passing a budget on time, the American people expect House Republicans to do their job. And when it comes to standing up for the 9,000 children in Flint and providing the same relief that we always provide to communities in need in this country, people expect House Republicans to do their job. Over the past year, the Future Forum has taken 18 of the youngest House Democrats to 14 cities across America. We've talked to young people, thousands of them, at community colleges, and workforce places. And what we have heard from Republicans and Democrats alike is that access to college and student loan debt is the #1 issue facing young people. 40 million young people have $1.3 trillion in student loan debt and are stuck in financial quicksand. And so they ask to House Republicans, what are you doing to be just as collaborative as we are as a generation? House Democrats have introduced legislation to address this. Congressman Joe Courtney has a bill that has 181 co-sponsors that would allow young people to refinance their student loan debt just as you can for a home loan and an auto loan. But it's been 392 days since that bill has been introduced, and not a single Republican has stepped up to do their job and join Democrats to put more money in more pockets to help students out of this financial quicksand. It's no wonder that young people are so disillusioned and so disenchanted with the way that Washington is working today under House Republican leadership. Further inaction will only engender further distrust in their government. And so, today, collectively, we are saying, on these issues, from our budget to corporate inversions to the Zika virus to the Flint water crisis and this financial aid student loan debt crisis in our country, House Republicans, it's time to do your job. And with that, I'll turn to Leader Pelosi for questions.
Thank you very much, Congressman Swalwell. As the director of the Future Forum, as the leader of the Future Forum, I thank you for your important statement today, for your leadership across the country, and for your strong statement asking Congress to do its job. I thank our distinguished chairman. These statements come from a very deep place with our colleagues. I thank Congressman Becerra for his strong statement on the budget and asking Congress to do its job. Congressman Kildee, from a very deep place, asking Congress to do its job on Flint, Michigan. And of course, Congresswoman DeLauro on the Appropriations Committee has many concerns that she wants Congress to do its job. And I thank her for her strong statement regarding Zika. Just as we were coming in here, I was handed this statement. New map finds 2 billion people at risk of Zika virus. The good news for the United States is that the carrier Zika can be found that even though it can be found as far north, anyway, it talks about how far north it's coming, even though the numbers are not as great in the U.S. yet. So there's reason to be hopeful if we get our job done. You know, a budget, we say this all the time here, is supposed to be a statement of our national values. Why have the Republicans not brought a budget to the floor? We have a saying in the world of that we live in, of public policy. If we want to know your value, if you want to tell us your values, show us your budget. Show us your budget. And I think that one reason they haven't brought a budget to the floor is that they don't want the public to see their lack of values in their budget, that they would make Medicare, remove the guarantee of Medicare. The list goes on and on. But even that is not cruel enough to some of their members. So maybe they don't want us to see their values. Maybe their values are not cruel enough to get the majority vote of the Republicans. In any case, they should bring it to the floor, do your job. With that, we'd be pleased to take any questions you may have. Yes, Chad.
What do you think is holding back funding for the Flint crisis? What exactly, what are the real obstacles legislative-wise that's not allowing, there are lots of efforts even from the Republicans that are saying that it should go forward.
Yes, do you want to speak to
Sure.
that?
Thank you,
And I
Leader
will
Pelosi. Well, I guess you'd have to ask them, but here's my analysis. It seems to be rather duplicitous for many members of the Republican Congress, especially those members who have participated in the committee hearings, for them on one hand to attempt to lay blame for the Flint crisis at the doorstep of the Environmental Protection Agency, which to the extent that they have responsibility, it's because it's those very same Republicans who have continuously voted to constrain the EPA in its ability to deal with environmental issues. So on one hand, they want to blame the EPA that they themselves constrain. But then on the other hand, when it comes to actually providing help to the people of Flint, I've heard it said from these same members that this was a state-created crisis. So here's my concern. You know, if a house is on fire, one does not call the fire inspector, assemble the city council, deliberate over how the fire was caused, and then make a decision as to whether or not we should do something about the fire that is burning. There's a fire burning in Flint, Michigan. There is a crisis in Flint, Michigan. They are citizens of the United States, and they are citizens of the state of Michigan. My legislation would say we will have a conversation about how this happened. But before we get to that, let's, as Americans and as Michiganians, come together to fix this problem and provide help. So I don't have a good answer as to why Republicans in Michigan and Republicans across the country have all the sympathy that they can muster, but don't use the tools that they have available to them in their very hands to reach out and help the people of Flint. It does, and I'll leave it with this, it makes one question as to whether there is something about the very poor community of Flint that is a majority-minority community that sets it aside from other places that perhaps would get more immediate response from some of these same people who seem to offer sympathy but no help.
And getting back to the point that Congressman Kildee made earlier about one of his earliest votes was for Sandy assistance. Overwhelmingly, the Republicans voted against the Sandy assistance for New York, while you proudly voted for it. And so some of what we hear from them is, well, it's not in my backyard. But when it is in their backyard, whether in other disasters that have befallen our beautiful country, they expect us to respond fully. So, you know, we're saying we want a supplemental because it'll take too long to get the full appropriations process done. The Speaker doesn't want a supplemental, and we're saying we just can't wait, whether it's Zika, whether it's a Flint or others. Yes, sir.
We're about 7 or 8 months into the new speakership of Paul Ryan here. I've had a number of members from the other side of the aisle say to me, well, new speaker, but we have the same membership, and they ascribe that mathematic as the reason we can't move any of these issues, whether it be Puerto Rico, Zika, education, budgets, et cetera. Do you lay that at the mathematics of the place that have not changed, or do you put that at the feet of Speaker Ryan, who has not passed a whole lot of major bills so far?
This is the Congress of the United States. The Congress of the United States. Each one of us has a responsibility to weigh in on our doing our job. And wherever the buck stops, the fact is Congress is not doing its job. And these are emergencies. These are emergencies, Zika, Flint, and others. So I'm not getting into what goes on in the Republican conference. You'll have to ask them about that, Chad.
But at the end of the day, that is the issue, that they were unable to move major bills under Speaker Boehner. He's responsible now, and you fault him in some way as being the person at the top.
Well, I'm just saying it's a dysfunctional Republican Congress. They have been obstructionist in terms of Congress acting and doing its job. They've been obstructionist to the president's initiatives, and now they want to make the third branch of government, the judiciary, an incomplete body and not being able to function fully. So this is an anti-governance attitude that exists in their caucus. As you saw, only 30-some members were able to threaten to vacate the chair, and Speaker Boehner left. So it's up to them to see how they can live up to their responsibilities. It's up to us to make sure the public knows what is at risk and what it means to the American people, that this dysfunction is not an academic conversation. It has a direct impact on the health and well-being and the economic security of the American people. Yes, sir.
Those of us who have tried to ask Ryan or Hal Rogers their plans on Zika have basically gotten the message, we need more information, we're working on it, we're going to act, but we haven't gotten a sense of how, when, or on what vehicle. I wouldn't be surprised if you've spoken to Hal Rogers or Paul Ryan about Zika, and maybe you can help the public get a greater sense of what's going forward in the future.
Well, I first want to yield to Congresswoman DeLauro, who's what we would call, has been a cardinal in the appropriations process and has been working on this as her subcommittee's jurisdiction.
Thank you, Madam Leader. First of all, this notion that the administration has not provided information really is misrepresentation. I didn't bring with me, but I held it up both last week in the appropriations process and just yesterday afternoon, about this much paper, very detailed as to what the money will be used for, whether it is at NIH, whether it is at CDC, whether it is at the Department of State. And I have personally been in briefings with Secretary Burwell and Republican colleagues. And the administration, quite frankly, has tried to provide as much information with the briefings, with justifications, with language, with charts. It is all laid out. I'm going to make this aside, which I made yesterday. We have more information about this than we had about going to war in Iraq. And where we couldn't find a weapon of mass destruction. And we spent $8 billion, which is unaccounted for today. And that's not my number. It is the Special Inspector General who said that with regard to the reconstruction there. But back to Zika. Yes, last week, Ranking Member Lowy, myself, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, where Florida is a real problem with regard to the Zika virus, we've said, oh, okay, if the administration hasn't provided you with this information, let's do a hearing. Let's bring the administration in. Let's ask them point blank the issues that you want to, you need to address.
Yeah, have a hearing.
They said no. Mr. Rogers yesterday said that we've had briefings and meetings, etc. This is a lack. I want to impute goodwill. There is no plan. There is no action except to say We don't want to do your supplemental, but we want you to take money from Ebola, which $510 million is already there, and which the World Health Organization, others have said that if we abandon what we said we were going to do in West Africa, that what will happen is that other countries back out as well. And that public health infrastructure that we are helping to create is not going to occur, and we will see additional flare-ups. I would just think, this is Dr. Bruce Aylward, Special Representative for Ebola at the WHO. Quote, "We are now at a critical period in the Ebola epidemic as we move from managing cases and patients to managing the residual risk of new infections. We still anticipate more flare-ups and must be prepared for them." There's been a recent flare-up in Liberia. The point is, they have no plan, they don't want to act, and while they are fiddling, American lives, people overseas, their lives are at risk, and we are telling American women, don't get pregnant.
On that, I'd like to always make the distinction between a reason and an excuse. And what Chairman Rogers, and I have all the respect in the world for him, I served with him on the Appropriations Committee, but what he and the majority, Republican majority, are saying is not a reason not to do the supplement, is an excuse not to do it. My understanding from the Republican leadership is they don't want to do a supplemental. They don't want to do it because if we have Zika and if we have Flint and if we have opioids, which we really need to do, then other people may want to add some other things. But that's not about leadership. That's just about an excuse, not a reason to do something. And if they don't understand the subject of public health because they ignore the scientific evidence as to how people are at risk, that public health, Ebola, Zika, and the rest know no boundaries, and that we have to keep Ebola at bay. And you don't do that by transferring the money to Zika and think that you are trying to solve a problem. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
On this question, has the GOP side given you any indication that they have a certain number in mind on top of the Ebola funds? In other words,
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Has the what?
has the GOP side given you any
GOP side.
number in mind? If not 1.9 billion, then some other number.
No.
No, they
No,
haven't.
they have not. All they want to do is to dismantle the global health security. And as the leader pointed out, it is an excuse not to act on the supplemental and do what we need to do. They have no number. They are not holding any meetings. We have nothing that says that they're willing to address this.
And they do not want to have a public hearing so that the public can hear the evidence to substantiate or to document the need. In closing, though, I just want to yield back to my distinguished chairman, Mr. Becerra, and to the leader of our future forum for any closing remarks they have, since the questions you addressed were to.
Again, to close, especially having talked to thousands of young people, it's a generation that's very collaborative and inventive, but a generation that's pulling its hair out when it looks at Republican leaders in this town and their failure to collaborate on these issues. And so as we continue to go across the country, it is quite frustrating when we're asked, what are we doing on corporate inversions to keep jobs here? What are we doing to just pass a budget like we all have to pass in our households? What are we doing to address Zika and making sure that our health care plan on that is not don't get pregnant? People are saying, just do your job. Be as collaborative as we are. And I think that's our message to House Republicans. Chairman Becerra.
I would simply close by reminding everyone that we run for office to be part of our government, and the job of government is to govern. And if you're not going to address the crisis that we now know with the Zika virus, then squarely on their shoulders, on the Republican shoulders, will be this crisis blowing up where women and many Americans may be in jeopardy, children's lives may be in jeopardy. If another student in America says, I can't go to this particular college that I got accepted to because we haven't dealt with the debt crisis in student loans, then that inability of that young person to go on to get that degree the way he or she wanted rests on the shoulders of the folks who don't want to do their job here. And if this Congress won't deal with the 9,000 children who have been poisoned by lead in Flint, that rests squarely on the shoulders of this Republican Congress that's not willing to do its job. If you don't want to govern, get out of the kitchen.
I think it's important to note that what we're hoping to do was to act in a bipartisan way to address these needs. In order for us to move forward as a Congress and as and governance, we want, show us your budget. We want to see your budget. We want the American people to see your budget so we can have a legitimate debate on the choices before the American people instead of a hysterical display of poor taste on the part of the Republican candidates. But the debate on the budget is as old as our country. It's a very legitimate debate to have, but we have to see theirs in order to debate it. So I thank our Chairman Becerra, Congresswoman, ranking member on her subcommittee on appropriations, Congresswoman DeLauro. I sympathize and thank Dan, not Dale, his uncle, Dan Kildee, for sharing the depths of his concern and the strength of his intellect on finding solutions, and of course, to have the perspective of Eric Swalwell, for Congressman Swalwell, very important to all this because all of this is about the future. So I thank them for joining us, all of us coming together today to say to the Congress, do your job, show us the budget, hear the pleas of the children of Flint, understand the threat that Zika presents to us, acknowledge the concerns of our young people, and as our chairman has said, don't waste our time on the floor of the House on bills that are going nowhere, at the same time ignoring inversions where money is going elsewhere. Thank you all very much.